Annual Conference on Genocide and Human Rights Research, and to introduce our keynote speaker. Each year, the GRAD conference features a distinguished community of scholars and presenters from around the world who share a commitment to genocide and human rights research. So I would like to begin by offering tremendous appreciation to all of this year's conference organizers, especially for the leadership of Drs. Sharon Bethea, Chieze, and Aissatou Ibrahima, for what promises to be an incredible 2 days of scholarly engagement and critical conversations. As you know, this year's conference focuses on agency, ethics, and everyday heroes, and the development of strategies for preventing genocide and human rights abuses in Africa and the diaspora. And I look forward to its engagement with key historical and political narratives, its highlighting of the role of agency and education in genocide and human rights prevention, and its testimony to the tools and acts of resistance performed by everyday people in confronting genocide and human rights abuses. I am therefore very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, who we are thrilled to be participating in this important dialogue. Professor Mamdani is an expert in the field of African history and politics and serves as Columbia University's Lehman Professor of Government, as well as director of the Makere Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda. His distinguished academic and professional background includes serving as founding director of the Center for Basic Research in Kampala, Uganda, president of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, and teaching appointments at the University of Dar es Salaam, Makere University, and the University of Cape Town. Professor Mamdani is also author of Saviors and Survivors, Darfur, Politics, and the War on Terror, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism, and the Genocide in Rwanda, and most recently, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. So on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and Northeastern Illinois University, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Mamdani and to thank him for serving as the keynote speaker for this year's conference on genocide and human rights research. Thank you.
It might do it. Oh, wonderful. Great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I thank the organizers of this conference, particularly Professor Ntihira Geza and the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Research in Africa and the diaspora. Thank you for mentioning my most recent book. This evening, it's evening in Kampala. I'd like to draw on that particular book to focus on 3 issues. The first is the history of the nation state, distinguishing between its 2 phases, the illiberal and the liberal. Based on this, I will distinguish between 2 tendencies: the genocide of minorities on the one hand, and their tolerance on the other. Second, I will explore the birth of a 2-state solution in North America, particularly in the United States of America, and with it the birth of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, first in the US, and then its export to South Africa, Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. This is at the same time the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in a legal distinction. At first religious, then a distinction between races and tribes. Third, and I think this relates directly to your concern, I will connect extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, along lines of the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the International Criminal Court and the human rights community? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? I have a critique of the human rights project, and I will make it in this third part. What is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, I take a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, likely the most intractable political problem in today's world. So let me begin with the nation state and its two histories. The nation state was born in Liberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within the boundaries of the state, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Jews and Muslims in Iberia. This was followed by a century of religious wars in Europe. I identify this as the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The liberal solution to religious wars was the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. John Locke theorized the liberal solution in his Treatise on Tolerance, published in 1689. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. In England, at the time Locke was writing, Protestants. The minority, again in England at the time Locke was writing, Catholics, must not participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original sin of liberal political theory. Now, in what follows, I'd like to comment on four issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I will compare the colonial conquest of Indians and the racial domination of Africans to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as two different ways of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, I ask, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of two different ways of thinking of political identity, as political and changing in one case, as opposed to natural and unchanging. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see it as the ground for a natural and permanent claim is to think of identity as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. Let me begin with the United States of America and the birth of a two-state solution, since this is where the conference is being held. Charity begins at home. Know thyself. I would like to distinguish between the structural position of two minorities in the US, American Indians and African Americans. How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indians or as natives? What's in a name? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Today we consider native a more politically correct designation. Yet neither the US government nor the peoples they colonized accept it. The museum in Washington, DC, dedicated to pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas, is called the Museum of the American Indian. It is not called the Museum of the Native American. The 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations. A separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968. To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and never have been rights-bearing citizens of the United States in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the United States. Though the reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, it's a polity separate from the US. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Whether they seek equality or advantage, immigrants come to join existing polities. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the United States. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall in mid-19th century, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, masks this reality of colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. It claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany also embraced a two-state solution after Nuremberg. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Holocaust Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews. As a result, even if the Nazi project was defeated militarily, it survived politically. The two-state solution gave the Nazi project a longer political peace. The latest version of the two-state solution is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its boundaries, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals, but not citizens. After that, Indians had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could be naturalized as US citizens. They were not considered native-born US citizens. They were naturalized. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different colonial solutions. Both were turned into minorities, one inside the state, the other outside it. One was sustained by colonial conquest, the other by racial domination. The consequences have been radically different. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if racial discrimination is common to both. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Colonization refers to conquest of territories. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, even receding at times, the one-state framework both underlined the necessity of developing alliances and made it possible. The two-state solution explains both the continued isolation of the reservation Indian through colonization and their ongoing fragmentation as a people. The radical difference in the political effect of each solution is clear from the American case. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building in a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate, and compounded that isolation with ongoing fragmentation in multiple reservations. I conclude that a one-state solution is politically preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. Let's look at South Africa. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. A delegation visited North America, USA, and Canada 2 years later to study how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has lived in a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland in reality masked a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, every homeland was said to have been administered by a traditional authority, also said to have existed from time immemorial, sanctioned by custom, more or less eternally. This authority was said to be customary, not elected. Third, this traditional authority claimed the right to enforce a customary law on those living in the homeland. Custom too was said to have been there from time immemorial. For custom to coexist with civilization, settlers insisted custom be excised of all repugnant practices or notions. Repugnant is a legal term used by settlers. I will return to discussing the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. The first was that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Hitler was full of admiration for America's westward expansion, the project during which the Indian genocide took place. The second lesson Hitler learned was that it is possible to create a second and a third-class citizenship, as of African Americans, Indian citizens after 1921, and later Puerto Ricans. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. The learning process has been documented by James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. I argued that post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the nation by expunging all minorities. Thus, Nazism was a return to the pre-Westphalian illiberal nation state. After the Second World War, there was an American debate on Nazism. Was Germany liberated or occupied? Was Nazism a state project or a social project? Who should be held responsible for Nazism? The nation or the state? Nazi leaders or the German people? The American consensus was that the responsibility for Nazism lay with the German people. At Nuremberg and after, millions were considered criminally culpable, though each one individually. Yet Nazism was never probed as a political project. This was the birth of the human rights paradigm. A similar debate unfolded inside Germany, particularly among German left intellectuals, the most prominent being Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse. Neumann wrote Behemoth, a book that dissected National Socialism. His answer: Nazism was neither just a state project, nor just a project of German society. Nazism was rather a nation-state project, a project of both the Nazi state and the nation, the folk, to eradicate the presence of national minorities, Jews, Roma, and others from state territory. From this point of view, Nazism was above all a political project. Denazification would thus require an alliance of all anti-Nazi forces, external and internal. The Allies and those sections of German society that had resisted Nazism. Denazification would have to be a primarily political and not a criminal project. This is the beginning of a foundational critique of the human rights project. But Americans were unwilling to do so. Only the Soviets were willing in the East, but only temporarily, and not after the Berlin Uprising. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. To understand why, I distinguish the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators. This is the human rights model. From the political model, which sees extreme violence as the result of group mobilization around a collective nation-state project. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish individual perpetrators in the fashion of Human Rights Watch, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies were and are mobilized. More importantly, rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived, victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all who survived the catastrophe we know as extreme violence. The point is to try and stop the cycle of violence by shifting attention from perpetrators to the issues that drive the violence. I would like to return to the Westphalian project and connect it to the modern colonial project. I'd like to suggest that we think of political liberalism as part of a counterinsurgency project, not only in Europe after Westphalia, but also in the colonies. One example, that of Sudan, provides an opportunity to study race and tribe making, race making and tribe making as a political project by the colonial power, Britain. I return to late 19th century. The late 19th century Mahdiya in the Sudan was one of three events that shook the foundation of the British Empire between mid and end 19th century. The others were the Indian Uprising of 1857 and the Morant Bay Rebellion in the West Indies a decade later. The subsequent imperial reform was led by Henry Maine, a member of the Viceroy's Legal Commission in India, who argued that the Indian uprising was the result of an epistemic defect. Maine called for an epistemic rethink that would both anchor the colonial project in a reshaped custom and fracture the colonized into smaller groups, each claiming a longer and thus authentic history. I examined this project in the context of Britain's reformed governance as it unfolded in two steps following the imperial defeat of the Mahdiya. The first step divided the population of Sudan into two major blocks, each identified as a separate race, one Arab, the other African. In Sudan, the language of race begins with colonialism. The second step was to divide each race into several tribes. Even if tribe may previously have designated a distinct cultural group, an ethnic group in the language of anthropologists, it now became the basis of several connected claims: a separate homeland, a traditional authority enforcing its customary law. An ethnic group becomes a tribe when it is politicized. And to be politicized means that the ethnic group is connected with a particular territory and therefore sovereignty. The Sudanese anti-colonial movement embraced these claims as if they were natural. The anti-colonial movement was thus more of a derivative than a creative act. From the start, the anti-colonial movement presented itself as a national movement. Embracing the language of nation, anti-colonialists described their struggle as nationalist, their object being to set up their own nation through an act of national self-determination. But that didn't settle the question. The question was, who was the nation? Who was the self in self-determination? Was the nation Arab, Islamic, or African? These three definitions of the nation sum up the three phases in the nationalist movement that followed state independence in 1954. The person who came closest to breaking through the nationalist mythology was John Garang, who argued that Sudan was both African and Arab, that Arabic was a language and Africa was a place. You could thus be both Arab and African. He called for a new Sudan, a state that would acknowledge Arabs and Africans as among its citizens. Garang's political project seemed to die with Garang when he was murdered. Those who replaced him in the SPLA called for the division of Sudan into two homelands, one for Arabs, the other for Africans. Backed up by a coalition of Western states led by the Troika, the US, Britain, and Norway, the project gave birth to an independent South Sudan, which in no time disintegrated as different tribal militias fought over the spoils, which included cabinet positions, ministries, even districts, each claiming the right to its own tribal homeland in a South Sudan that should rightfully be a federation of tribes. In less than 2 years, the tribal coalition fell apart and a tribal war followed in 2013. Faced with this unanticipated catastrophe in the short aftermath of a much celebrated independence, the African Union set up an independent 5-person commission of inquiry. The commission produced 2 reports. The majority report reproduced the logic of Nuremberg and the human rights community and cozied up to the International Criminal Court. It denounced the violence as criminal and demanded that individuals be held responsible for it. As always with the discourse on criminal justice, the assumption was that the state cannot commit a crime. This is the problem in human rights discourse, one problem. The state cannot commit a crime, only individuals in the state can. I authored the Minority Report and suggested we think of violence as political, and thus look for a solution by calling for the reform of the state based on a project other than that of creating a nation state. What is crime? It is breaking state law. By definition, the state cannot commit a crime. Only individual state agents can. So how do we understand the violence enabled by state law? Not as criminal, but as political. Not as Nuremberg did, but as the South Africans did. Let me turn to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. First were those who had never left. They were among the natives of Palestine. Second were those who returned to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This group were known as the first aliyah. They were immigrants. Then followed those in the second and the third aliyahs. They looked to create their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. These are the settlers. The settlers seek to create their own state. Zionists drew a lesson from Germany. Victims of the nation-state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation-state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This catastrophic expulsion is known as the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat whose numbers must be cut down. In other words, the Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. In this context, Palestinians face two options: a one-state solution where they would face racial exclusion, including political marginalization, but within the same state. In contrast, the two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect rule colonialism under Zionist rule. Neither settler nor native, book I talked about earlier, argues that a one-state solution will provide a better framework for building alliances for a durable resistance. Second, I argue that resistance is not enough. One also needs the vision of a different future. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid for a glimpse of a third alternative, for an alternative vision. A different vision emerged in South Africa in the 1970s. Before the 1970s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. It uncritically embraced the architecture of apartheid and in the process reproduced it. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans organized as African National Congress, Indians as Indian Congress of Natal, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. Apartheid's ideological hold was not broken until the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, white and black. The starting point was after black students under Biko left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers starting with Soweto. Radical white students left in the wilderness turned to organizing hostile workers on the fringes of these same townships. The turning point in anti-apartheid politics was not the armed struggle, but the strikes that began in Durban in 1973 and the uprising in Soweto in 1976. The Soweto uprising unfolded under the banner of Black consciousness. Biko said, "Black is not a color. If you are oppressed, you are Black." The important thing is to recognize that there was nothing inevitable about the impact of Black consciousness on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC, Black consciousness, could have led to a nation-state consciousness. It could have claimed that South Africa is a Black nation of the Black majority, thus essentializing Black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of Black as a historical political identity. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition. Even here, there was no consensus. The rift inside the Afrikaner community was demonstrated by the publication of a book called My Traitor's Heart by Rian Malan, the great-grandson of a former Boer state president. Malan was a crime reporter for the Johannesburg Star. His beat covered Black townships. Each chapter of his book focused on a specific type of what was then called Black-on-Black violence. One chapter was devoted to the Hammer Man, a big Black man who wielded a heavy hammer to smash the skull of his victims, all equally Black, but poor people who would yield small pickings. Malan's subtext was not difficult to decipher. If they can do this to their own, what will they do to us whites, if given half a chance? The South African movement was born in the 70s and 80s. Its birth was marked by a threefold shift in vision. From opposition to apartheid, they looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than being content with turning the world upside down, they dared to think of a different world. That's the first part of the shift. Second part, from a state of the majority, the national majority, the Black majority, the resistance began looking to create a state of all the people. And thirdly, from opposition to whites, the resistance went on to oppose white power. Not whites, but white power. I suggest we think of 1994 as marking the birth of a new political project, starting with the forging of a new political community. The alternative would have been to capture the existing community and to rupture it into two separate ones, as in Sudan, one for victims, the other for perpetrators, one for Blacks, the other for whites, requiring a partition of South Africa as of South Sudan. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners were divided about the future. A minority wanted a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. Oranjezicht. The anti-apartheid movement chose a different future, a common future for survivors of apartheid, who they often described as a rainbow, not just victims who survived, but all who survived, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the significance of the political rebirth that was 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of political decolonization. The turning point was the reformulation of the central demand from Black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, they refused to allow racial difference. They refused to endow racial difference with the political significance. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, Detribalization would decouple the link forged under colonialism between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland. To do so would reverse the process whereby colonialism and apartheid politicized culture through the creation of homelands and of a homeland authority that would enforce a customary law. The result would be a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state, and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa regardless of race, but it has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. It will more likely lead to an internal civil war. The result will stink, like the 1994 genocide in Uganda, or its mini version, the ongoing xenophobic violence in South Africa. I'd like to turn to Israel-Palestine. At the core of political Zionism is a political project to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as in the nation. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel, because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, the state decides who gets to be officially recognized as a Jew. If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question of who is a Jew. Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the Israeli state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity, or both? The state of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by halacha law, religious law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, European Jews, who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who claimed to be civilizers, committed to bring other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are the Arab Jews. They present a special challenge to Zionism, for Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile towards one another. Otherwise, there would be no need of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they denounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. After several decades, the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind the stark religious Zionism that has two targets, not only the Palestinians, but also the Ashkenazi. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. The Zionist demand is that after the Holocaust, the squatter must make room for returning native and get out of the way. The development of a Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home, and from an all-or-nothing demand from Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon, the brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister. This was a total war against Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to Rashid Khalidi, the leading Palestinian historian. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. Even if the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian nationalism only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada in the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. The second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both Intifadas responded to the failings of the official Palestinian liberation movement. The second Intifada in particular reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going as far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, National Democratic Alliance, a political party led at the time by Azmi Bishara, Palestinian MK, member of the Knesset. Bishara and Balad's contribution can be summed up in two bills he introduced in the Knesset over the years. The first was a new basic law calling for collective rights and complete civic equality, but not political equality, of the minority and the majority. This first bill was still within the framework of a nation-state politics, accepting the distinction between the majority nation and its minorities. The second bill went a step further. It asked the Knesset to affirm that Israel is, quote, a state of all its citizens, end of quote. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset explicitly to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of the Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the state of Israel, there is reason to give it full and enthusiastic support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society, and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason for caution. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on. That is the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. As a participant in the anti-apartheid boycott, I came to realize that its key mistake was to collapse state, regime, and society into a seamless whole. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. They become a mirror image of precisely what they oppose. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with the domestic strategy to isolate pro-state forces within society. By driving a wedge between pro-state forces in civil society and those not aligned to the state. For Palestinians and Israelis, both those anti-Zionist and non-Zionist, the South African struggle offers two lessons. In Israel as in South Africa, this means overcoming two categories of divisions. The first is the division among victims of the nation state. In South Africa, the population was divided among township dwellers in Bantustan residents, a barrier overcome by a coalition of students and workers. The victimized population was also divided racially and tribally. The racial barrier was overcome by Black consciousness movement, while the tribal barrier remains. Among the Palestinians, there is the tripartite division of victims. Those living in the diaspora, the occupied territories, and Israel proper. Each of these groups has been further differentiated. The diaspora includes those in the refugee camps and those beyond. Residents of the occupied territories are split between the West Bank and Gaza. And oppressed citizens of Israel include Arabs, Druze, and Bedouin. Each microgroup is subject to a different political and legal regime designed to produce a specific and separate subjectivity. The second phase in South Africa led to winning over a sizable number of apartheid supporters to the anti-apartheid cause. That may be harder in Israel. That said, we cannot forget that the ground shifted from under the apartheid state when Afrikaners, who provided most of the foot soldiers for apartheid's machinery of repression, opened up to an alternative to the apartheid order. The Afrikaner shift from the right of the political spectrum to its middle range shows that no political identity is permanent. What can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something else is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political. The Palestinian moment will come when the resistance recognizes the complementarity of two seemingly different objectives: to unify the oppressed and to fragment their opposition so as to isolate core opponents. I should say to fragment Zionist society so as to isolate core opponents. The goal should be to arrive at a point whereby it's not just the oppressed who seek political change, but many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on a double recognition that there can be no military solution to the Israel-Palestine question, and that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. Apartheid fell because of a confluence of two developments. The better known of these is the anti-apartheid uprising in the townships. The uprising brought diverse groups under a single umbrella. The result was not a victory, but a deadlock. Why then did the National Party choose to go to the negotiating table? To shift focus from a military to a political struggle? Because the NP realized that it was beginning to lose the supply. Because it was beginning to lose the support of an important section of the Boer intelligentsia. These were calling for a political solution to the problem of apartheid. The writing was on the wall. More and more of this intelligentsia were convinced that whites did not need to monopolize political power to have a home in South Africa. It is this lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible. That Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel, Palestine. Indeed, Jews are more secure in New York City than they are in Israel. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home to anti-Zionist and even non-Zionist Jews in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahmood Mamdani. This is so wonderful, so profound, so overwhelming. So an attempt to summarize, I've attended many of Professor Mamdani's lectures. An attempt to summarize it is an act of injustice, so it's impossible. So, but in order to give the audience opportunity to put together their question, I will just remind us that Mamdani, provided a history of the nation states and the two-state solution in America, and then he provides a critique of human rights project. And then of interest to my own research is how he raised the project in South Africa as a possible solution for what's going on in Israel and elsewhere. So especially I'm interested in his critique of this two-state solution. And so my question, while others put together, is going back to South Africa. So Professor Mamdani, what do you think is the role of such a charismatic leader as Nelson Mandela? Or do you consider him a charismatic leader? What role did he play in unifying South African different allegiances that basically proliferated into ethnicities and tribes? Do you think that the Palestinians or other oppressed groups need such heroic figures?
Should I answer now?
Okay. If you want, okay, we can put together a set of questions so that you can address them all. So one of the other questions is, how do you reconcile? I don't know whether you're able to read the questions on the Q&A. So if not, so I would say, how do you reconcile your arguments about the expansionist concepts of internal colonialism faced by Black Africans? And that's on the one hand, and the notion of one of our professors here came up with the notion of eternal colonialism. And the person, the questioner is asking, is it possible to reconcile these two concepts of internal colonialism and eternal colonialism? And then how do you also reconcile the concept of indigeneity with eternal domination of Africans? So that's one question. Another one is, so what sort of political strategy did South Africa adopt in the post-apartheid period to create a state for all tribes? And why did South Africans turn to xenophobic experience in recent times? So I think while you give, take on these questions, and then we'll collect the second batch of questions.
That's a lot of questions. Okay, I'm not quite sure I get the second question, but I will try, and then you can tell me if I'm off. Okay. So, how do I understand Mandela's role? And does everybody need a Mandela? Mandela was one leader. There were others. Mandela was put in jail when he was heading Umkhonto Wasizwe, an organization for armed struggle. For 27 years, Mandela was in jail, Robben Island. A lot happened in South Africa during these 27 years. During these 27 years, a new mode of struggle developed, other than armed struggle, popular struggle, non-violent popular struggle, direct struggle. The Mandela who was shaped by this struggle was not Nelson Mandela, it was Winnie Mandela. Nelson and Winnie Mandela present us with two phases of the South African struggle. The more conventional one, armed struggle, is the face of Nelson Mandela. I say conventional because it really wasn't successful. It didn't even happen by and large. It was just a demonstration event. The struggle that brought the apartheid regime to its knees was not a struggle mounted by exiled guerrillas. It was a struggle mounted by ordinary people inside South Africa. Workers, students. I've argued that the key person in this struggle was Steve Biko. It is Biko who taught his student constituents that black was a political experience. It was not a biological experience. And that the point was the unity of the oppressed. That's what Biko taught. Biko created the basis of unity of the oppressed across racial boundaries. Mandela brought it towards the end. Mandela also made crucial compromises. Neoliberalism, swallowing the IMF package. All of those in the name of realism, and I believe justifiably so at the time. But they would have to be recognized as forced compromises. They would have to be recognized as part of an agenda to be realized in the next stage of the struggle. What the anti-apartheid movement did not create was a state of all tribes. Ironically, it created a state of all races, but not of all tribes. It's here. If you're looking for an explanation, for xenophobic violence. Sorry, that was my phone. That explanation lies here. 1994, South Africa becomes independent. There's an election. The big question in this election is, who will have a right to vote? Question is very important because South Africa had drawn in millions of migrant laborers from across its boundaries. These laborers had been the mobilizing force behind the trade union movement, particularly Fosatu in the 70s, but also Kosatu in the 80s. Would they have the right to vote? There were two positions. One position said only citizens should have the right to vote, meaning those born in South Africa. The other said South Africa belongs to all those who live in it, the Freedom Charter. Second position won. Political rights in South Africa belong not to citizens of South Africa, but to residents of South Africa. That's a revolutionary change. But from 1994, there was a coalition government. Chief Gatshebuthelezi became the Minister of Internal Affairs, and the Inkatha Freedom Party took control of the Home Ministry. And they began to pass a series of administrative regulations which progressively disenfranchised those not born in South Africa. Those born in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in Lesotho, in Botswana, in Swaziland, Malawi, wherever. Inkatha Freedom Party explained to its members that these people had no rights. That is why there was no social justice. They were grabbing what should rightfully belong to South African citizens. Xenophobic violence began in the mid-90s and has continued since. It is interesting that xenophobic violence is not against the racial stranger. Black South Africans accept racial strangers. That's what the anti-apartheid struggle achieved. But xenophobic violence is against the tribal stranger. They do not accept tribal strangers as members of their own society. Problem. So the project is incomplete. I don't think that South Africa offers a solution. There are many problems. South Africa is replete with problems, but I think that South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, created a vision. It's that vision we need to think about. They have not been equal to realizing that vision. The struggle continues. Sorry for a long answer to a short question.
Thank you very much. I think that helps. Just the last batch of questions, because I think we are running out of time, and I'm sure you have deserved your well-earned rest. So thank you. So one of us asked, aren't Ashkenazi Jews regarded as inferior, uncultured, by Sephardic Jews of Westerners in general? And even though both of them constitute the majority factions in Jewish population. That's one question. And another question is, why did the fall of South Africa not lead to the fall of white supremacy? And if that's the case, why would you even recommend the South African experience as a solution for all other struggles? And then the last question, or the last two questions. So how does the term survivor apply to all those who survived extreme violence, including victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and others? And then back to Israel again, isn't the difference between Israel and South Africa the fact that in Israel, so the difference between Palestinians and the Jews constitute in religion, whereas in South Africa is the difference between whites and the blacks is rooted in culture.
That's hilarious. What is religion? It's not culture. Okay. So Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. I think I was not able to explain myself fully. So the Sephardic Jews are the ones who came from, expelled from Spain, came to Ottoman lands, where they were welcome. And they are a part of the Mizrahim. Mizrahim are the Arab Jews. So the rift is the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi. The Ashkenazi Jews believed they had a civilizing mission. The Mizrahim must be civilized. The Mizrahim must stop speaking Arabic. But of course, along the way, the Ashkenazi discovered that it was very useful to have Mizrahim who looked like Arabs, sounded like Arabs, and could not be told apart from Arabs, even by Arabs themselves. So the Mizrahim became the intelligence service of Israel. They penetrated Arab society. They became the media service, Arabic language programs, etc., etc. The Mizrahim went into the settlements. Mizrahim are the majority in Israel. Mizrahim were like the Boers. Remember, the Boers were supposed to be the most racist. Right? The English claimed to be liberal racists. Not the Boers. My interest is in the Boers, is what happened. Because the English never really joined the anti-apartheid. Individuals did, of course. But when the Boers changed, they took the change seriously. So, I don't really know what the question is, but just explaining Mizrahim and the Ashkenazi. Why did not the fall of South Africa lead to the fall of white supremacy? That's a great question. Why did not the fall of apartheid lead to the fall of white supremacy? The fall of apartheid is what we would call a political revolution, not a social revolution. It brought about a change of government based on one person, one vote. It brought South Africa in line with most African countries in one way. With a black government. But you had a civil society and an economy which really was not that of an independent country. But you had black empowerment. You did not have social justice, but you had affirmative action. The new bourgeoisie, the new economic elite, had the texture of a rainbow. You know, I come from Uganda. When I went to South Africa in 1994, I couldn't believe how much it reminded me of Uganda. In the sense that come out of a colonial period where injustice was racialized. And after colonialism, the demand for justice was racialized. Idi Amin, in a way, you can say, responded to a popular demand. He was a demagogue, and as a demagogue, he responded to it by creating Black empowerment. He created an economy and a middle class which was predominantly Black. So I kept on wondering in South Africa, is there an Idi Amin around the corner? I mean, don't these people realize that they're on a short leash? But of course, nobody does if they have a winning hand. They don't realize that the game itself will be up. Why do I recommend it? What's the alternative? Look, the reason we had 1994, the settlement, was because the anti-apartheid movement was not strong enough to make a revolution. But it was strong enough to achieve some very basic political reforms. I've called it a political revolution. Reforms which would change the conditions on the ground, making it possible to create a deeper and more comprehensive mobilization for social justice. Survivor. I have a very, very fundamental disagreement with the human rights group. I don't believe it. Look, if you've looked at any society with extreme violence, take Rwanda, for example. If you do a historical study of Rwanda, as I did, you will recognize that violence is not a standalone act. It comes in cycles. Each cycle is motivated by revenge. The victims of the last cycle become the perpetrators of the new cycle, and so on. How are we going to stop this? Survivor's justice? That's a polite way of saying revenge. In my view, we can't just partition societies. I believe South Sudan was a step backwards. Garang recognized it. Garang recognized that the point was to transform the Sudanese state, to transform the South African state. It hasn't been transformed, okay. I don't think the way forward is to pit victims against perpetrators in this round. Look at it, the TRC was a joke. came out with a list of 20,000 perpetrators. Most of the perpetrators were in the liberation movements, then in the South African police, then in the South African Defense Forces. What is this? None of the beneficiaries were perpetrators because beneficiaries don't hold a gun. There's no smoking bullet. Human rights theory does not recognize beneficiaries. It only recognizes perpetrators. Perpetrators, we know, are not the real force. You don't find them inside the army. You don't find them in the police force. The people you find in there are poor people. Final question. So, the challenge is to create a society of survivors. That's my point of view. Palestinians and Jews have a difference of religion, really, not culture. What I've been trying to say is there are two kinds of Jews. The Ashkenazim who came from Europe, classic European settlers. And the Mizrahim, the Arab Jews who shared the same culture with Palestinians. Palestinians don't have the same religion. Palestinians are Muslims, they are Christians. The vast majority of the leadership in the Palestinian resistance movements have been Christians. It's not about culture. And it's not about religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. And so I think that brings it to a close of this session. And we are so grateful for you making our time to attend to this, to give us this wonderful lecture. So I'm sure many of us still have questions, but I think we'll eventually collect the questions and then forward them to Professor Mamdani, who will get back to us. So thank you.
Collect the questions and read the book.
Okay,
I wrote a book to answer those questions.
All right.
Okay. May I welcome you to dinner? I'm going for dinner now.
All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy. Thank you again. So we'll spread the news about your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janine, for inviting me.
Enjoy dinner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
That
you
was
for
amazing.
coming. That was beautiful. Thank you.